There have only been a few times throughout gaming history that we've seen a console manufacturer forced to bow out of the competition and go third party. One such time came after the failure of the Dreamcast, forever remembered as Sega's last console. What makes the Dreamcast's unfortunate fate so intriguing is that the console was widely praised at the time and is remembered incredibly fondly today. How can a system that is almost unanimously beloved also be the device that killed a once thriving console brand? This is how not to save a console. Sega was going through a bit of a rough patch in the mid to late 90s. Their last few hardware outings had not performed well, with the Sega CD, 32X, and Saturn all falling well below expectations. The Saturn generation was particularly concerning, as a new competitor had joined the fold with Sony's PlayStation. Sony's announcement of their new console truly shook Sega to their core. For much of Sega's existence, they had been in a two-man race with Nintendo, and Sega had often staked their reputation on being more powerful and offering things Nintendo couldn't. So when reports came out stating that the PlayStation may surpass Saturn in power, Sega risked losing a potential advantage they had built their brand on. In a last-minute effort, Sega managed to enhance the Saturn and reclaim the throne as the most technically strong console of the generation. However, as you may imagine, this sudden change led to even more complications. It made it harder for developers to take full advantage of the system, especially early on. It also caused the Saturn to be the most expensive console on the market, retailing for $100 more than that pesky PlayStation. Additionally, before Sega chose to enhance the Saturn, they had considered dropping it entirely and shifting focus to a different console. Those preliminary discussions of a new console caused rumors of Saturn II to begin appearing before the original system had even been released. This made many game developers hesitant to support the Saturn, as they didn't want to spend time creating games for a platform that may be replaced so quickly. In the end, those developers were correct, as I think it would be fair to say Sega never truly committed themselves to the Saturn. Sega began development of the successor very early on, hoping to get a leg up on both Nintendo and Sony. This brings us to the early development of what would become the Sega Dreamcast. In 1996, Sega of America hired Bernie Stolar as their new president. Stolar was one of the first people within Sega to push for a move away from Saturn. This pivot from the Saturn was not a particularly popular decision, as the games on the platform were fantastic and fans were generally happy with it, especially in Japan. But Stolar was adamant that the Saturn would never work as constructed and they needed to move on. Determined to not repeat their prior mistakes, Sega took an interesting approach with this development cycle. They created two separate teams, both tasked with making their own version of Sega's next generation console. The first was an American team. This US project was known as Black Belt. Meanwhile, a team in Japan was also hard at work on a new machine. This version was codenamed Dural. Both consoles were aiming to achieve similar goals, with the primary differences coming from the chips and other internal workings that would be used. At one point in development, Black Belt was shown to developers and was reportedly very well received. However, Sega chose to go with Dural. It seems somewhat unclear why exactly Sega chose to favor this version. Part of it may have been due to a falling out between Sega and 3DFX, the primary partner Sega had been working with on Black Belt. It may have also been because Sega saw the success Nintendo had working with NEC on Nintendo 64, which Dural would be using. It has also been said that Black Belt focused more on specialized 3D effects, while Dural focused more on raw power, which Sega preferred. Whatever the reason, Dural won the two-team competition and full development began. At this point, the console began being publicly referred to as Katana. Katana had a few primary goals in mind: deliver arcade-level graphics at home, be an easy system for developers to create games for, and most important of all, hit the market before Nintendo or Sony's next console. It all led up to the first official reveal at a Sega press event titled Sega New Challenge Conference. On May 1st, 1998, the event was held in Tokyo and the hype was palpable. It was here that the official name Dreamcast was introduced for the first time. Much of this conference focused on the hardware itself, announcing partnerships with NEC and Yamaha, among others. There was one partner in particular to make an appearance, which is a bit surprising to see looking back on. Microsoft was there, including a personal video message from Bill Gates himself. Knowing what we know now, Microsoft would have been in the midst of developing their own hardware, which of course would become Xbox. I wonder if Sega was aware of this at the time. Regardless, the presentation continues by showing off the console itself and the very interesting new controller. The bulky controller was built with the VMU device, aka Visual Memory Unit, in mind. This device could be plugged directly into the controller, with its primary function being a memory card, but it could also display display some simplistic images and be used to enhance gameplay. Finally, it's time for the technical showcase, featuring a variety of tech demos. The most famous one was the animated head of Sega President Irimajiri, which aimed to show off the new visual capabilities of the Dreamcast system. The Super Mario 64 home screen-esque demo is truly nightmare fuel, but boy, those textures sure did look great. The Dreamcast was given a Japanese release date of November 20th, 1998. This would be quite a bit sooner than any other region. I find the decision to release Dreamcast in Japan so early to be a bit strange. Japan was the only region that had actually responded pretty well to the Saturn, and those fans were not thrilled that it was being replaced so soon. It was standard for the Japanese console manufacturers to release their systems in Japan first, I do get that, but if there was any time to break away from that trend, this would have been the time to do it. At launch, Japanese interest in the Dreamcast was significantly lower than Sega had hoped. As if that wasn't problematic enough, there were supply chain issues, with NEC struggling to produce the necessary graphics chip. Sega had reportedly hoped to send out 500,000 consoles for launch, but could only manage 150,000. Meanwhile, there was only going to be 4 games ready for the November 20th release date. Some of the most highly anticipated games, such as Sonic Adventure, had been delayed, slowing initial momentum. All in all, the Dreamcast launch in Japan felt very rushed, and part of that was by design. Sega was hoping to build a significant install base before Sony's next console was released. Sega believed the PS2 would release in Japan in 1999 and scrambled to get ahead of it. Ironically, the PS2 would not end up releasing until 2000, meaning Sega rushed for basically no reason. All of these factors led to a disappointing Japanese launch. Early on, the Dreamcast missed all of Sega's internal projections. Obviously, the supply chain issues played a role here, but interest just wasn't there regardless. In June 1999, not even one full year after launch, Sega had to make a drastic move, lowering the price of the Dreamcast to just 19,000 yen. That is 10,000 less than the initial launch price of 29,000 yen. As you can imagine, this staggering price drop led to a huge boost in sales. However, this price drop was so extreme that Sega was now losing money on every Dreamcast console sold. Selling consoles at a loss isn't unheard of, in fact it's been done quite often, but Sega was not really in a position to take these losses considering the failure of their last several consoles. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to sell as many consoles as they could before the PS2 was released. And while this move certainly did help improve console sales, Sega was now losing money that they couldn't afford to lose. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Sega of America was preparing for the North American launch. And the good news is, things were looking a whole lot better. Sega was pumping money into the North American marketing campaign throughout 1999, reportedly spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Their iconic It's Thinking ad campaign featured action and futuristic imagery, perfectly painting the vibe Sega was going for. Sega wanted to make sure you knew the Dreamcast was going to be the first new console of the upcoming generation, bringing us into the future we had once only dreamed of. But before we got to the North American launch, a very surprising event occurred on August 11th, with Sega of America announcing President Bernie Stolar had been fired. Remember, Stolar was the first one to advocate for a move away from Saturn, and he had an immense impact on the Dreamcast's development. To see him get fired right before the console released seemed concerning. It's not entirely clear what led to this decision, however there were a lot of rumors. Some claimed the issues began when Stolar played a prank on Sony executives, sending a Sonic mascot and Sega merch to a Sony-sponsored golf tournament. But Stolar claimed this event had nothing to do with his firing and that the Sony execs thought it was pretty funny. It was also widely reported that Stolar announced the Dreamcast to have a US launch price of $199 against the wishes of the company, essentially going rogue and choosing the price that he personally believed in. Some of that story is probably a bit exaggerated, but it is true that Sega of Japan was not happy with this price, so it's reasonable to assume it played some role. Overall, it just seems like Stolar and Sega of Japan were butting heads constantly, and by the time the Dreamcast reached the finish line, it was best to go their separate ways. I thought it was important to bring this up, as the Dreamcast was losing the person who had been its biggest supporter amongst Sega leadership. I think it goes without saying that's not a great sign. Stolar was replaced by Peter Moore, and there was no time to waste, as Dreamcast's North American launch was quickly approaching. All of this led up to the North American release date of September 9th, 1999, or as it's better known, 9/9/99. This release date further pushed the Dreamcast's vibe of being as cool as could be. The console was cool, the TV ads were cool, the games were cool, even the release date was cool. It created a totally new image for Sega in this region, and hype was incredibly high. When September December 9th came around, the Dreamcast launched with an incredible lineup of games. The extra year the console had in Japan meant a whole ton of games were ready, including releases like Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, and NFL 2K. Upon release, the Dreamcast was an immediate smash hit, setting new sales records. Sega called it the biggest 24 hours in entertainment retail history, selling over 200,000 units for an estimated $98 million in revenue. The console had already sold 1 million units by November, and by Christmas, Bloomberg reported that Sega now held a 31% market share in the North American video game industry. The Dreamcast would also be released in Europe a month after the North American launch and gained similar early success. By Christmas of 1999, Sega of Europe said the console had sold 500,000 units in the region, which was reportedly 6 months ahead of their internal expectations. What made the Dreamcast so great and so popular early on was that it truly felt next-gen. Obviously, games looked and ran better, that was to be expected. But what made the Dreamcast truly exceptional was its other features, specifically its online capabilities. The internet was becoming increasingly popular throughout the 90s, and Sega was the first console manufacturer to offer a built-in modem for online play. It cannot be overstated how huge this was, and I give Sega a lot of credit for seeing this trend early and capitalizing on it. When games like Quake 3 or NFL 2K1 were getting released with full online play on Dreamcast, it was just absolutely game-changing. Features like this helped the Dreamcast sustain a lot of momentum going into its first full year on the market, and things were looking great. Unfortunately, everything was about to change. It was finally time for the moment Sega had been dreading since before the Dreamcast was even released. The PlayStation 2 was on the horizon, releasing across the 3 major regions throughout the year 2000. All of the momentum Sega had gained in the past year disappeared in the blink of an eye. In Japan, the PS2 sold 1.4 million units in the first month, burying the Dreamcast in the region they had already been struggling in. As for regions like North America and Europe, the PS2 took a lot of the attention away from the Dreamcast, and sales began to slow down. This is despite the fact that the PS2 was hurt by shortages in the USA. Sega had hoped this shortage would lead consumers to Dreamcast. Instead, most customers were happy waiting for a PS2 restock. What was even more concerning was the fact that many players were even choosing to pick up the PS1 over the Dreamcast. Throughout the year 2000, the 5-year-old PS1 outsold the Dreamcast 5-1. Obviously, the older PS1 hardware was being sold for much cheaper than the Dreamcast, but still, it wasn't a great sign. Also, the upcoming PS2 was going to be backwards compatible with PS1 games, so it would be fair to assume many of the people who had bought the PS1 throughout 2000 would be more likely to stick with the PlayStation ecosystem and get a PS2 down the line. The Dreamcast didn't have that advantage. Another advantage that the Dreamcast missed out on was DVD support. As we've mentioned a few times throughout this series, the PS2 supporting DVDs and having the ability to be used as a DVD player was one of the biggest reasons why that console achieved such an absurd amount of success. With DVD players being relatively new, many people who were looking to purchase one quickly realized they could just buy a PlayStation 2, netting them a brand new game console and a DVD player at the same time. Sega, meanwhile, chose to avoid DVDs this generation due to their higher costs, sticking by their proprietary GD-ROM format. But they quickly learned that extra cost would have been worth it, as they gave Sony a major advantage with this decision. Sega had been extremely forward-thinking with Dreamcast and nailed almost everything, but this one big feature they had chosen to ignore was a brutal blow. Sega's internal projections stated that the Dreamcast needed to sell at least 5 million units in the US by the end of 2000 to be considered a sustainable platform. It fell 2 million units short of that goal. With the Dreamcast falling behind quickly, Sega cut the price down to $149 in North America, making it half the cost of the PS2. But as we mentioned previously, Sega was not in a position to sustain price cuts like this. Even if sales improved, there was no money being made. As the Dreamcast held on for dear life, the gaming industry continued moving forward, with Nintendo announcing their new GameCube system in May 2000, and with Microsoft joining the console space, announcing Xbox in early January 2001. Meanwhile, PS2 stock was becoming more accessible and the console was flying off the shelves. With all of these factors combined, the writing was on the wall. There was no way Sega was going to be able to keep up in a console space with 4 different systems on the market. Thus began an internal struggle among Sega, with many of the top US executives, including President Peter Moore, strongly advising that Sega leave the console business. Top Japanese executives were vehemently against announced this, at one point standing up and walking out of a presentation that Moore was giving. But ultimately, the numbers don't lie, and if Sega wanted any hope of continuing on as a company, they would have to leave the console space behind. And after much strife, they eventually did. On January 31st, 2001, Sega announced they would be exiting the console business. The Dreamcast would be discontinued on March 31st, 2001, just 18 months after the console's promising North American launch. Following this announcement, Sega would continue to support the Dreamcast for the next year or so, putting out the games that were already scheduled for release. But they would also act as a third-party publisher, releasing games on other platforms. While it was certainly a dark day for Sega fans and employees, the general reception to this news was somewhat positive. Sega's stock price soared, and many industry insiders were happy to see Sega focusing on software, as that's what they were best at. Sega got to work quickly, announcing a partnership with Microsoft in March 2001 that stated 11 Sega games would be coming to Xbox. And Sega was there on day one of Nintendo's new GameCube console with Super Monkey Ball. It was certainly bizarre to see Sega games coming to other platforms, with the most famous of all, of course, being Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, launching on GameCube in North America on February 12, 2002. It goes without saying that seeing Sonic on Nintendo hardware was just utterly mind-blowing. It felt like living in a complete alternate reality. Obviously, the Dreamcast and Sega's console business was long gone at this point, but I feel like Sonic being on a Nintendo platform was the true "it's really over" moment. Ultimately, this decision to go third-party saved Sega, with the company announcing they had a profitable 2003. This was their first profitable year in half a decade. That brings us to the end of the Dreamcast story, and as I look back through it all, it's just astounding to me how fast everything fell apart. As we head to the last segment of this video, where we summarize how not to save a console, I'm left with a whirlwind of thoughts in my head. The Sega Dreamcast has to be the most tragic story we've talked about throughout this series so far. Most of the failed consoles we've covered previously had easily recognizable flaws and mistakes, whether it be the console features, the marketing, the branding, the games, or whatever else. But the Dreamcast didn't have any of those problems. It was a well-made machine with futuristic features, a great slate of games, and a lot of early enthusiasm. And yet, it faced one of the quickest console deaths we've seen. In the case of Dreamcast, most of its problems stemmed from factors completely out of its own control. First and foremost, Sega's negative brand reputation and company status set the Dreamcast up for failure. For years, Sega released unintuitive hardware that they were extremely quick to drop. This led to a lack of trust from both consumers and game developers. There was a hesitation to support anything Sega was doing because you never knew when they would suddenly choose to move on. The Saturn was the biggest example of this, as the company seemed uncommitted to the product before it was even officially released. For a lot of players and developers, especially in the Japanese market, the Saturn was the last straw, and they were never going to go back to a Sega console again. Sega's only option was to try and rebuild the reputation. They had to deliver a fantastic new console that could help erase the poor memories of the past. No matter how good that new console was, it was going to take time to win back customers. But it was time that Sega couldn't afford due to their string of previous failures crushing them financially. If the Dreamcast had come under different circumstances, Sega could have roughed it out, and despite being overshadowed by the competition, they would have continued releasing great games, pushing online console gaming forward, and gaining back trust from fans and development partners. It could have set them up for a slam dunk follow-up system, but they were already too far gone. If they didn't get out of the console market when they did, bankruptcy would have hit them long before a follow-up console could. Another factor that hurt the Dreamcast was Sega's internal strife and general lack of direction. There seemed to be a growing disdain between Sega of America and Sega of Japan around this time. This once again takes us back to the Saturn, when Bernie Stolar was hired and immediately moved away from the platform. It seemed from that moment forward the two branches were never fully on the same page. There were many disagreements about the Dreamcast's features, most notably Sega of America having to push extremely hard for internet services. The bizarre firing of Bernie Stolar coming about a month before Dreamcast's North American release was also a big red flag. Going through major internal changes 1 month before a console launch is never going to end well. There were some other events in the general gaming market that harmed Dreamcast as well. The biggest was of course the PS2, but I don't think we need to get into that too much. It goes without saying that a single console dominating the market that strongly is not going to bode well for its competitors. But aside from the PS2's dominance, I think the upcoming GameCube and Xbox consoles pushed Sega out as well. The console space had already become crowded with the big three of Sony, Nintendo, and Sega, with Sega beginning to be squeezed out. Now a fourth console was going to be thrown into the mix with Xbox, and with Microsoft being an extremely dominant company in North America, they would be gunning for the region where the Dreamcast had found the most success. I don't always see people mentioning this, the story is always just Dreamcast versus PS2, but I think the Xbox reveal was the true breaking point. After all, the Dreamcast discontinuation announcement came just a few weeks after the Xbox was first shown. Sega had failed to gain a significant install base in a 1v1 with the PS2, so it was only going to get worse with two other consoles joining the competition. To focus back more on the console itself, I stand by the fact that I think Sega nailed almost everything. The only major mistake I identified was the lack of DVD support we mentioned earlier. This is a mistake that every console manufacturer made this generation except for Sony, and it's not a coincidence that the only console to support DVDs with no adapters or add-ons required was the console that rose above the rest. It's a shame because the Dreamcast did so much forward thinking and nailed every feature they were banking on, but missing out on the DVD revolution was a killer. All in all, the failure of the Dreamcast was an unfortunate but nearly unavoidable outcome. Sega was just too far gone, and despite the Dreamcast's valiant effort, it wasn't enough to turn around Sega's hardware aspirations. But on the bright side, Sega was able to become a massive third-party publisher and find a lot of success there, saving the company. While it certainly stung Sega fans around the world to see them leave the console space, I think we would all agree it's a better outcome than losing Sega entirely. Sega reached a much more stable and successful place once they stopped making consoles, and that has continued to the present day. In fact, Sega is absolutely killing it lately, overseeing incredibly successful franchises like Persona and Yakuza. They've recently made a commitment to bringing back old beloved IPs like Jet Set Radio and Crazy Taxi. And of course, their all-important mascot Sonic is doing better than ever with some very high-quality game releases in a billion-dollar movie franchise. As much as the story of Dreamcast may hurt, it's clear that it was ultimately the right decision for the company. And while it may not have been a major success at the time, the Dreamcast has lived on as one of the most widely praised and beloved retro game consoles of all time. The Dreamcast will always be remembered as Sega's last console, but it was also a truly incredible piece of tech with a legacy that has lived on to this very day. And I think that's pretty special. I hope you enjoyed this episode of How Not to Save a Console. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, it helps out the channel a ton. The Dreamcast was one of the most highly requested consoles for me to talk about in this series, so I'm glad I could finally make it happen for you all. Thanks for watching.